A common theme does exist among people with Asperger's and high-functioning autism, specifically their tendency to exhibit both behavioral and cognitive rigidity, which spouses often perceive as stubbornness and being insensitive, selfish, uncaring, narcissistic, and numerous other adjectives. But the behavioral and cognitive rigidity that gets perceived as just rude behavior is definitely a response to anxiety. There's a strong correlation between anxiety and inflexibility, and that can be evident at home, and it also can be evident in the workplace. So a vulnerability to anxiety is definitely an intrinsic feature of Asperger's or high-functioning autism, and that's due to three different things, really. It's due to a specific neurotransmitter system defect. It's also due to a breakdown in circuitry related to extinguishing fear responses. And it's also a secondary consequence of the individual's inability to make appropriate social judgments. So there's numerous factors at play that increase anxiety in people on the autism spectrum. I could spend the next hour talking about that, but I'll try to keep this answer fairly short. A lack of empathy significantly limits skills for autonomous social problem solving. For example, the individual is unaware in many cases that he has said hurtful things or behaved in inappropriate ways. And this results in him, we'll use the example of an NT wife and the husband with autism. This behavior that he exhibits often gets him in trouble with his wife. I work with men on the autism spectrum a lot, and it seems like they all say, yeah, they're in the doghouse, and they feel like they're always in trouble. So this all relates to a lack of empathy, or we will call it a lack of displayed empathy. They have empathy, they just don't necessarily display it. And this limits skills for autonomous social problem solving. Social problem solving, that's an important term to remember. Limitations in generalizing from one situation to another often contribute to in this case, the autistic husband repeating the same social mistakes over and over again. If he gets into a heated argument with his NT wife over a specific problem, and she conveys to him what he needs to do differently next time, he will get it with that specific problem. But if there's a second problem that's just slightly different, he may not necessarily be able to generalize from the first problem to the second problem. Also, another factor that is at play that increases anxiety is the individual's inability to grasp social cues, facial expressions, body language, and so on. So this creates a lot of repeated social errors because he's misinterpreting what is being expressed to him. Social limitations also make it difficult for him to develop coping strategies to soothe himself and to contain difficult emotions. And so those are just a few. There's many more. The circumstances that raise the anxiety level for people on the autism spectrum often result in their increased need to control people, places, and things. This need for control takes the form of rigidity, which is what you were referring to in your question as stubbornness. So there's behavioral rigidity and cognitive rigidity. Behavior rigidity refers to the person's difficulty in maintaining appropriate behavior in new and unfamiliar situations. Okay? And then there's cognitive rigidity, and this occurs when the individual is unable to consider alternatives to the current situation, alternative viewpoints, or innovative solutions to a problem. People with rigid thinking do tend to view situations in either or terms. It's either right or wrong, good, bad, black, white. They want concrete black and white answers, and the gray areas of life are often very uncomfortable for people with behavioral and cognitive rigidity. Symptoms of rigidity often introduce some of the most disruptive chronic behaviors exhibited by people on the autism spectrum. For example, aggression, difficulties tolerating changes in routine, dislike of changes to plans that have been previously laid out. You may have experienced with your partner on the spectrum his or her meltdowns, frustration, shutdowns, and problems with minor differences in the environment. I get a lot of feedback from NT wives that say they feel that they're always walking on eggshells in an effort to circumvent any extreme reaction from their very brittle Asperger's husband. In addition, the husband himself may articulate his anxiety over fears that things will not go according to plan or that he'll be forced to make changes that he can't handle. Sometimes these behaviors are identified as obsessive compulsive because of the husband's need for ritualized order or non-functional routine. In other words, he has a strong need for sameness. So, as one can easily imagine, behavioral and cognitive rigidity causes many problems in relationships, which usually result in a higher level of anxiety for the person on the autism spectrum. Therefore, this cycle just continues at that point.
And I want to take a look at what's really behind the anger that you witness in your autistic spouse, because there's always something behind the curtain. The only thing you see is anger, but there's a bunch of other stuff going on that's the core issue. We'll look at each of these in turn. It could be anxiety, emotional vulnerability, grief or depression, hurt, low self-esteem, powerlessness, and even fear. So we'll look at each of these in turn. Anger hides anxiety, okay? Our bodies interpret anger as a threat to survival, and as a result, we release adrenaline and noradrenaline to help us cope. Now, these hormones act as an analgesic. In fact, anger makes us feel better in the short term because it numbs our emotional and physical discomfort, but that's not a healthy long-term solution. So people on the autism spectrum should not allow themselves to get addicted to this kind of painkiller. If they do, then outbursts of anger may become a way of life. And unfortunately for too many people, in this case spouses on the autism spectrum, anger has already become a way of life. Anger also hides emotional vulnerability. Some people on the autism spectrum use anger as a way to distance themselves from their NT spouse. Perhaps they feel safer if their spouse is held at arm's length, or maybe they find it hard to express their true personal needs and desires. Anger also hides grief and depression. It's very common for people on the autism spectrum to respond to grief and depression by getting angry. And this is their way of coping with the pain that they're feeling. And the reason that they would opt for anger instead of feeling grief is because anger is less painful. Anger also hides hurt. Admitting that we feel hurt is too much for some of us. It's almost better to explode in rage than to show we care or that we're upset by whatever's happened. So hurt hides behind anger when you feel unloved, rejected, or criticized. And many people on the autism spectrum remember those high school days and all the teasing, harassment, bullying, rejection, and so on. And they have carried that childhood anger into adulthood. Anger also hides low self-esteem. A person on the spectrum who's been experiencing anger control issues for many years may admit to himself, if not to others, that he sometimes struggles with self-esteem issues. He may have internal dialogues that revolve around themes like, any minute now somebody will see that I'm useless or I'm stupid or a complete fraud or not good enough, and so on. And sometimes these feelings of shame are just too painful to bear, and a less painful emotion would be anger. Anger hides powerlessness. You know, if we go through life feeling weak, hopeless, helpless, overlooked, or undervalued, anger often hides these feelings of powerlessness. And lastly, anger hides fear. The most common feeling that hides behind anger is definitely fear, but unless we're developing a habit of mindfulness, which is making ourselves aware of our emotions as they arise, it can be difficult to identify the emotions lurking beneath our anger. Our best indication of what those emotions may be is to consider how we feel about ourselves at the times when we are not feeling angry. So those are the 7 big things that really go on behind the anger. What you see is anger, but what's going on behind the anger can be anxiety, emotional vulnerability, grief or depression, hurt, low self-esteem, powerlessness, or fear.
We want to look at 3 anger styles in autism spectrum disorder level 1, and they would be fight, flight, or pretend. With the fighters, it's anger turned to aggression. And the fighters are pretty simple to recognize because they can be very verbally abusive and parental. Some of the characteristics would be uncontrollable fits of rage. They seem to have emotional diarrhea and let it out all the time. They can be openly and often defiant of requests from their spouse. They often feel that their spouse's opinions and perspectives and rules are stupid and don't apply to them. They may often demean or swear directly at their spouse. They may make threats, and these individuals are largely cynical and negative in general. The flighters would be described as anger turned to passive responses. Now, the flighters can also be fairly simple to recognize because they're passive. They don't fight back when confronted, and often they will opt for a shutdown rather than a meltdown. And some of the traits that you may witness if you're dealing with a flighter would be they tend to spend a lot of time alone, they seem withdrawn, they seem to hold anger in, they show very little emotion, they appear depressed, they seem emotionally constipated, they also may have numerous physical problems, headaches, muscle aches, upset stomach, and other physical symptoms that result from holding it in. They may simply go along with whatever the other spouse requests just to avoid conflict. They also may have few friends outside of work-related friendships. They may blame themselves unnecessarily. They'll often live life as a loner and engage in solitary activities for extended periods of time. They will hold their anger in and hold it and hold it and hold it and then blow up suddenly and violently. They'll also have difficulty expressing emotions. And sometimes they're so extremely passive, they will tend to get walked on by others. They don't engage in much conversation, and they deal with difficult emotions by cutting the emotions off. The flighters are in danger of destroying themselves emotionally from within. They're kind of like a balloon being constantly blown into with no release valve. When they explode, their anger may be exceedingly verbally abusive, but then they recover quickly once they've blown off that negative energy. The pretenders can be described as anger silently planning revenge. And perhaps the most difficult to detect is this particular anger style, because the individual seems to be calm on the surface, but he or she is raging, scheming, and planning underneath. So they are very passive-aggressive, with emphasis on aggressive. Now, these individuals don't directly confront the anger as a fighter would. They will tend to be passive and appear to accept what is said, and then will disregard what is said to do their own thing. So in this regard, they're kind of sneaky. And they may even go unnoticed because they're so sneaky. They often lack the courage to be direct, and they often become very skilled at being deceitful. They kind of know where the back door to revenge is and will use it often. Some of the specific traits would be they tend to sabotage. They tend to avoid direct conflict while creating problems in other areas. Sneaky behaviors. They often get caught in lies. They may not admit mistakes. They become very good at blaming others and are convinced in their mind that the other person is 100% at fault. And you will also witness a lot of inconsistency between what is said and what is done. So in dealing with an autistic spouse, the first step would be to identify the preferred anger style. The next step then would be, if your spouse is willing to cooperate with you, to do a little analysis to look for triggers to their preferred anger style. In this way, you can avoid the triggers when possible. If the trigger can't be avoided, then both you and your autistic spouse can be on high alert that you're engaging in a particular situation or circumstance or conversation where you're at high risk for experiencing one of those anger styles. And so in those cases, an extra dose of grace and mercy and compassion and understanding would be in order. So in working with neurodiverse couples, both the NT spouse and the ASD spouse, I have run into, for many years now, this thing where there's basically 3 different anger styles. And usually the spouse will exhibit one more so than the other 2. So the first one we're going to call the knee-jerk reactor. Now this spouse goes from 0 to 100 just like that. They're easily and quickly triggered, and they go off instantly, repeatedly, over even small infractions. That's the knee-jerk reactor. Then we have what I'm going to call the stuffer exploder. This person stuffs their feelings.
Something's frustrating, they stuff it. Something angers them, they don't say anything. Something is annoying as hell, and they try to sweep it under the rug, anything to keep the peace, and they stuff and they stuff and they stuff, and then they explode. Big time. Then they feel guilty for exploding and go back to stuffing again. Then we have the stuffer imploder. This individual will stuff their feelings, sweep it under the rug, anything to keep the peace, on and on and on and on, and they never explode. Rather, they implode, and that implosion is depression. Okay, so we have the knee-jerk reactor, the stuffer exploder, and the stuffer imploder. Which one are you? Here's what happens a lot in a neurodiverse marriage where one person is autistic, the other one is not. When the NT wife approaches the ASD husband to talk about relationship problems, he runs because he feels attacked. When he runs, she chases after him because she feels abandoned. Cognitive restructuring enables people on the autism spectrum to correct distorted conceptualizations and dysfunctional beliefs. The process involves challenging their current thinking with logical evidence and ensuring the rationalization and cognitive control of their emotions. Now, the first stage of cognitive restructuring is to establish the evidence for a particular belief. People on the autism spectrum often make false assumptions of their circumstances and the intentions of others, and they have a tendency to make a literal interpretation, and a casual comment may be taken out of context or may be taken to the extreme. All people are vulnerable to distorted conceptualizations, but people on the autism spectrum are less able to put things in perspective, to seek clarification, and to consider alternative explanations or responses. So neurotypical spouses can encourage their autistic spouse to be more flexible in their thinking and to seek clarification using questions or comments such as, "Are you joking?" or "I'm confused about what you just said." Such comments also can be used when misinterpreting someone's intentions, such as, "Did you do that deliberately?" And to rescue the situation after they've made an inappropriate response with a comment such as, "I'm sorry I offended you," or, "Oh, what should I have done instead?" One common effective misinterpretation is the development of paranoia. The person on the autism spectrum can have difficulty distinguishing between accidental or deliberate intent. Now, neurotypical people will know from the context, body language, and character of the other person involved that the intent was not to cause distress or injury. However, people on the spectrum can focus primarily on the act and the consequence. So people on the spectrum may need to be trained in checking the evidence before responding and developing more accurate mind-reading skills. I got an email from a neurotypical woman who's in a relationship with a man with Asperger's syndrome, and she's asking, why is my husband so sensitive to criticism? It seems as though everything I say, he perceives that as me being critical, and then he gets very defensive, and then the arguments start. Well, in order to answer that question, we really have to talk about the amygdala, which, as many of you know, is just a part of your brain. But it's more than just any old part. It is the fear center of the brain. It helped us survive back in the day, quite honestly. And people with Asperger's syndrome do tend to have an overly active and even in some cases physically enlarged amygdala. And so that would explain briefly, why they have such anxiety. The disorder comes with anxiety, but also they grew up in an environment that reinforced that anxiety, namely knowing that they just could not fit in socially. The link between the amygdala and fear processing does indeed shed a lot of light on how anxiety can take root in a child's mind, the child having high-functioning autism or Asperger's, and then develop into long-term problems as an adult. Now, the link between the amygdala and anxiety served us really well back, 2 million years ago, when we were cavemen and we were facing life-threatening dangers every day. So let's say, for example, you encountered a saber-toothed tiger, and this tiger greeted you with a very loud, threatening growl, and his big incisor teeth were glaring at you, and so your amygdala would jump into action and trigger a fear response, rather than encouraging you to go over there and pet the kitty, right? So in this case, you would either fight or flee or hide. But in addition, since this experience was accompanied by strong emotions, it would also be processed into a lifelong memory. So in other words, the next time you left your hut or your cave or whatever, you would generalize. In other words, you would know that all tigers, not only the one you met, are dangerous.
and you therefore would wisely avoid being around them. Now, this was very useful back then, but in modern life, it creates a huge problem, especially if you're already hardwired to have an overly active amygdala like people on the autism spectrum and all across the spectrum have. So now, fast forward to today, a child with high-functioning autism or Asperger's is unfortunate to experience unsuccessful attempts at making friends, keeping friends, and socializing. In many cases, he wants to make friends, he just can't quite fit in, and so he gets ostracized, rejected, ridiculed, and even bullied. The uncomfortable feelings this will inevitably produce, coupled with the memory processing of the amygdala, will unfortunately start a vicious cycle of generalization and avoidance behavior. And what this means is the child will associate people with distressing emotions, and that'll stimulate anxiety, which will in turn reduce the child's ability to interact with people and interpret their behaviors positively. So when I say he generalizes, he in essence makes a thinking error that because these one or two people mistreated me, therefore all people will mistreat me. Now you fast forward to adulthood, where this person is trying to get into a romantic relationship with a neurotypical. He's already on guard. He's already been through a lifetime of rejection and ridicule, and now he's in this situation where he has to be highly social, which is not his cup of tea. And since he struggles socially, relationship problems inevitably occur. And as his partner tries to correct the relationship, sometimes this gets downloaded in his brain as criticism, and he has flashbacks to previous criticism. And so he is quick to feel like he's being yet again ridiculed, put down, and made to feel like shit. You could think of your Asperger's husband in this case as someone who has a severe sunburn. And you know, when you've ever had a severe sunburn, just a touch, just a mild touch by somebody else leaves you screaming. And so your Asperger's husband has already suffered some emotional damage from social failures previously in his life. And so now the slightest touch, in other words, the slightest positive or even constructive criticism, will be felt as painful criticism and put-downs.
His self-esteem is very low and very fragile, and he may not even know that. If he has ASD level 1, it comes from not quite being able to fit in. We're talking about way back in childhood. Couldn't quite fit in, was maybe ostracized by peers, rejected, bullied, teased, whatever. If he has ASD level 1, he's going to have mind blindness. It's going to be difficult for him to understand the motives of other people and why they behave the way they do. And unfortunately, if you don't know, you will fill in the blank with something negative. That's very popular for the ASD child and young adult and full-blown adult to negatively spin behavior that's not understood and motivation that's not understood. And he's also going to grow up going through life, if he has ASD level 1, not understanding his emotions or the emotions of others. He is going to have some executive function deficits. He's going to have anxiety as a result. He may also have sensory sensitivity, all of these things. So he has grown up, let's put it like this, where social contact, unless it was with people that were doing something very similar to what he was doing in his special interest area, social relationships were just fucking messy. They were messy. Could never quite figure out, how do I deal with this person? What am I doing wrong? No matter what I say or do, it's like there's a disconnect. To put in the context of the neurotypical wife, no matter what I say or do, it's never good enough. I want to make her happy, but I just don't seem to make her happy. So, and I've had guys that tell me, I've had a few guys say, well, no, I think my self-esteem is pretty much intact. But when I do a little further investigation, they don't really know what high self-esteem looks like because their self-esteem has always been low. If you grow up in a dark room and then somebody comes in one day, let's say you're 50 years old, and says, wow, your room is really dark. And you go, what do you mean? It's always been like this. This is the norm. Another thing that many guys will tell me, but I don't feel particularly anxious. I don't think I have anxiety. Okay, well, when was the last time you shut down? Oh, well, earlier this morning. Okay, so if you don't have anything to contrast it with, you've always had chronic low-grade anxiety from pretty much day one, and you've always had low self-esteem for pretty much day two. You don't have any way to contrast, to compare. Well, I had high self-esteem, and now I have low, so now I can tell that right now it's low or high. Or I've always been calm, but now I'm kind of anxious, and so I can see, I'm anxious because usually I'm calm. Since even some of your neutral comments are not totally understood due to mind blindness and emotions blindness and executive function deficits. He, whoever he is, If he doesn't understand your motives, your behavior, why you're saying what you're saying, why you're feeling the way you feel, he will fill in the blank with something that is usually negative. In fact, I will say always negative. If I don't understand this thing, I'm going to fill in the blank with something. I'm going to give it my best guess. And it's going to be a negative spin for sure. It's going to be a negative reframe of your behavior. And so now I think that you're against me. I think you're out to get me. I think you're being parental. I think you're chastising me. I think that you think that I'm defective and flawed and you're trying to correct me and fix me.
Explain why your ASD spouse may be hypersensitive to criticism, even constructive criticism, and sometimes he or she may even download your neutral comments as criticism. So, one, certain childhood experiences may lead to greater sensitivity. For example, a child who received constant harsh criticism or consistently mixed messages from his parents, caretakers, teachers, and so on, or someone who had difficulty getting along with peers, or someone who did not receive positive reinforcement for accomplishments, or whose sense of competence and confidence was not fostered or allowed to flourish, is likely to have difficulty receiving and processing criticism in a healthy manner. Furthermore, when a parent has unrealistic high expectations of a child or overprotects the child from any disappointment or criticism, this too may lead the child to become more sensitive to criticism as an adult. Number 2, a cognitive bias that leads the ASD individual to interpret ambiguous information in a negative way may also contribute to his or her sensitivity to criticism. Some people are more sensitive to criticism than others due to this cognitive bias that leads them to interpret ambiguous information negatively rather than in a neutral or positive manner. Now, a sensitivity to criticism describes not only the person's reaction to critical feedback, but also his ability to understand or interpret criticism. A person who experiences a greater sensitivity to criticism may be more likely to experience a decrease in motivation to cooperate, and he or she may also want to avoid further opportunities for criticism to potentially manifest, which means he or she may not want to engage in any conversations that are reminiscent of past conversations where they downloaded their NT spouse's message as insulting. And of course, low self-esteem can make one very sensitive to criticism. Mind blindness, emotions blindness, some executive function deficits, anxiety, problems with prediction, all of those can also at some level contribute to a hypersensitivity to criticism. Having said all that, sometimes criticism is negative and hurtful, and criticism that's intended as a personal attack can be harmful. So when criticism is excessively harsh, it's nothing short of being full-blown, unadulterated bullying.
I got a bunch of questions here, all of which are from neurotypical wives about their husband with autism spectrum disorder. And these are questions specifically from the NT ladies in my counseling groups. And I thought I would just address them all in one cluster here instead of doing them individually. And so we'll run through here real quick. The first one, she asked, does autism spectrum disorder, does the diagnosis of that change anything? Well, the actual diagnosis doesn't change anything, no. It doesn't change who your husband is or what he can accomplish. It does give him somewhat of a roadmap to the traits that he's likely to experience and some of the treatment strategies to address those traits. But the diagnosis in and of itself doesn't change anything as long as the two of you know that you have communication breakdown and it causes a problem for both of you and you both want to fix it, then we don't necessarily need to label that anything other than communication difficulties. And the next question is, does ASD level 1 get worse with age? And the answer to that is not likely. Most teens and adults with autism spectrum disorder have less severe symptoms and behaviors as they get older. And that's not to say that all adults on the spectrum get better, but the vast majority of them will. Some of them do get worse with age, but that is almost always the case with the individual who has just excessive amounts of anxiety and depression and then engages in so much destructive behavior to reduce his anxiety that his symptoms do get worse over time. The next one, can you be slightly autistic? Yeah, there's a spectrum, as you know. There's high functioning, moderate functioning, and low functioning, but even on the high end of the spectrum, which we call high functioning autism, right, there's another smaller spectrum. So that would be like high functioning, high moderate functioning, high low functioning. So there are some people that are so high on the high functioning end of the spectrum that they literally pass under the radar, and as far as everybody else is concerned, they're neurotypical. And the next question is, what are some of the red flags that I need to be aware of that may indicate my husband has autism spectrum disorder, as my suspicions lead me in the direction to believe that he does? Basically, if he has difficulty interpreting what you think and feel, if he has trouble interpreting your facial expressions, body language, and any other social cues that you give off, and if he has difficulty regulating his emotions, in other words, you witness shutdowns and or meltdowns, or we could also maybe call them adult temper tantrums, low frustration tolerance, these things would definitely indicate that a diagnosis, if he wants to seek a diagnosis, might be appropriate. What triggers my husband with Asperger's syndrome meltdowns? What triggers his meltdowns? Usually that has to do with sensory sensitivities, changes in routine, anxiety, communication difficulties that result in anxiety as well. So remember that people on the autism spectrum have this thing called mind blindness, which means they have a lot of unpredictability in their world, and so they try to make it as predictable as possible, and that comes through the use of a lot of routine and structure, and they don't like change as a result. And so when any changes to his routine come along, that is a trigger for a meltdown. But really, the changes in routine is just one form of anxiety-producing events. So the big picture here is anxiety is the main trigger for meltdowns, and there's different components that could be subsumed under anxiety. Those would be like sensory sensitivities, changes in routine, communication difficulties, and so on. Can a person with Asperger's feel love? Well, I would hope that we wouldn't even have to answer that question. Your husband with, in this case, Asperger's, he's not an automaton or a hologram or a robot, although I have some NT wives that say her husband does come off like Spock from Star Trek. But of course they feel love. They don't necessarily display their emotions much. So he would have empathy, but he may not have displayed empathy. And what I mean by that is he may not behave in certain ways or say certain things that convey empathy to the level that you would want. But he certainly can feel love and can certainly express empathy. In fact, in some cases, believe it or not, the ASD individual is so empathic that he has found from a very early age that it's just too painful to feel that empathy. He feels too closely the pain of others, and that is so anxiety-provoking that he literally shuts his feelings off. And so there it does appear that he's not a very loving, caring, sensitive, empathic person. And the next NT wife asks, what are the main symptoms to look for? Well, I touched on that earlier. But some of the main signs would be if your, in this case, husband, I assume, finds it hard to understand what you're thinking or feeling, if he tends to get very anxious about social situations, if he finds it hard to make friends and prefers to be by himself over there somewhere engaged in his special interest away from family, if he often seems blunt, rude, are not interested in others without meaning to, that would be a main sign. And if he finds it hard to say how he feels and finds it hard to comprehend how you feel, those I think would be the main signs of autism spectrum disorder. Next, does ASD cause anxiety? Absolutely, 100%. I don't know anybody, and I've been working in this field for a while, who has Asperger's or high-functioning autism that does not have anxiety. There's varying degrees. Some have really high anxiety, some have moderate. But if they have super low anxiety and they've been diagnosed with ASD, they've probably been misdiagnosed. And the last question I'll entertain today is, do the symptoms of Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism ever go away? Sometimes it's possible that the traits outlive their lifetime, and so to speak. So some of the traits that the individual may have exhibited as a teenager, for example, he's no longer exhibiting those. So research does in the past several years has shown that children can outgrow a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. In other words, their symptomology has lessened or decreased so dramatically as they've grown into the teenage years and young adult years that if they were to go back and get retested, they actually would just fall right out, just outside of the zone of being on the autism spectrum. So, and a lot of that has to do with early intervention, making sure that the child is taught social skills and gets all the other interventions that are needed at a very young age. I'm just kind of paraphrasing what some of the questions are like. They're wanting to know why they cannot get their husband with autism spectrum disorder to get it, quote unquote. That being, it's hard for them to convey to him how important it is to be emotionally reciprocal, to spend time with them, to make her feel important, and so on. And so they've pleaded and argued and complained and tried to be nice and tried to be tougher and all these different things, and they still say, I can't get him to get it. But just remember that you're probably employing a traditional approach that would work with the neurotypical brain. If you were trying to plead with somebody else, let's say a neurotypical coworker, and you use the method that you're using with your ASD husband, the NT coworker would probably get it and would want to cooperate with you. But the method that most NTs use to try to get their ASD husband to connect, it actually makes a bad problem worse in many cases, because it downloads in his mind as she's being parental and punitive. And this often raises his anxiety level, which in turn exacerbates the very symptoms of the disorder that you're annoyed with, namely low on empathy. So the paradox is due to some of the traits of the disorder, specifically executive function, theory of mind deficits, and weak central coherence. We'll take a brief look at each of those. And these are the three main traits that get in the way of the NT trying to establish a connection with her husband with Asperger's or high-functioning autism. So the first thing is executive function. Now, this can be defined as a way in which people monitor and control their thoughts and actions. It's actually a broad category that includes processes such as working memory, planning, cognitive flexibility, inhibitory control. Inhibitory control is one aspect of executive function, and it's the ability to restrain or inhibit potentially interfering responses and to self-regulate in certain situations. And if your husband can't self-regulate during difficult conversations with you, what that looks like is he either shuts down or melts down. And the second thing that gets in the way of her trying to establish a connection is theory of mind deficits. Theory of mind is the ability that we all have in order to make sense of the world we live in. Every person's thoughts, knowledge, beliefs, and desires make up his or her own unique theory of mind. From the ages around 4 years or so, typical kids, those without autism, understand that other people have their own thoughts. They have their own knowledge base, beliefs, and desires that will influence their behavior. However, people on the autism spectrum appear to have some difficulties conceptualizing the thoughts and feelings of others, and that downloads as lack of empathy in the neurotypical wife's mind. Since he has difficulty conceptualizing and appreciating her thoughts and feelings, she therefore makes the leap of logic that he evidently doesn't care, and he's selfish, narcissistic, and so on. So it is this mind blindness that may impair people on the autism spectrum to be able to relate to and understand the behavior of others. Mind blindness also means that, in this case, the ASD husband has difficulty in distinguishing whether someone's actions are intentional or accidental. So by failing to account for others' perspectives, people on the autism spectrum tend to misinterpret their messages. And many of the social skills deficits observed in people on the autism spectrum have their genesis in the lack of ability to decipher subtle meaning from the environment. For example, facial cues, body language, tone of voice, wordage, and so on. And then the third and last trait that gets in the way of the NT wife making a true connection as she would like is central coherence, and this is the ability to focus on both details as well as the big picture. So people with autism spectrum disorder appear to have a heightened focus on details rather than the big picture. And this is a cognitive style termed weak central coherence. Now this is the reason in this case, the ASD man has hypersensitivities to sensory perceptions. So the inability to hold information in mind in order to use it later in other tasks is what causes the person with ASD to lack central coherence. A lack of cognitive central coherence can easily cause, in this case, the ASD husband, to miss important and subtle cues that create meaning in a social context. So with these three traits that I just listed, central coherence, theory of mind, executive function, I don't really understand what might be in the mind of my NT wife in this case, what she might be thinking, and then what she might be feeling based on her thinking, and then why she behaves the way she does based on her feeling. And I don't understand her opinions, I don't understand her perspective, and sometimes her feelings are utter nonsense to me because I don't have an emotional vocabulary. I'm out of touch with my feelings, and therefore I'm out of touch with her feelings as well. So, long way around the bush to describe this, but in a nutshell, you have the NT wife who is highly social and highly emotional, and then you have the ASD man who is low perhaps in social skills and emotionality, but very high in logic. And so she appeals to him through emotions and from social competencies, while he tries to appeal to her through logic. She's speaking German, he's speaking French, and they don't understand one another. So one thing that often comes up when I'm working with neurotypical women in a relationship with a man on the autism spectrum, or vice versa, is she will say, I try to talk to him and he doesn't get it. I keep going over the same thing again and again and again. He doesn't get it. I keep trying to tell him what the problem is and what he can do to help alleviate the problem. He still doesn't get it. And so with this business of problem solving, what you're running into, if you're not getting the problem resolved, is you guys aren't agreeing on what the problem is. I run into this every time, as in 100%. She will go, when she's talking to him, well, the problem is this. And he'll go, no, that's not the problem. The real problem is that. And she will go, what? Are we on the same planet? No. This is the problem. I'm telling you, that's the problem. And he goes, no, that is not the problem. You're wrong. This is the problem. So you see where this gets nowhere, because the two of you can't even agree on what the freaking problem is to begin with. So the first step in problem solving, which doesn't even get to the desired result, because you have to first establish some kind of a bond or some kind of a trust that we are going to just worry about identifying the problem. Let's don't worry about solving it just yet. Let's just see if we can identify it. So that would be the first step. Now, I understand in some cases the two of you are just going to disagree what the problem is, and that's fine as long as you agree that you're going to disagree on what the problem is, but we still have found the problem. It's just now the problem is 1A and 1B. So it's still, in a sense, just one problem. It's just a two-pronged problem. So anyway, this is the deal that I run into is you guys are first going to have to somewhat agree on what the problem is and then move from there. But if you say the problem is A and he goes, no, the problem is B, and you try to compromise, negotiate, have a meeting of the minds based on two versions of the problem, most often that's going to be a fail, because he's going to want to resolve problem B while you're trying to resolve problem A. And since the two of you aren't working together, the rest is history. The problem doesn't get solved. Hey guys, this is Mark. And if you're in a neurodiverse marriage, you have probably noticed that you have a hard time resolving conflict. And the problems pile up in the closet, and they've been piling up for how long? Several years, decades. And so the reason that you're having a hard time resolving some of these marital issues are as follows. I have discovered in years of counseling couples that the main reason you don't resolve problems is because you try to fight too many problems at once. How's that been working for you? You haven't even been able to resolve one problem, let alone 3 or 4 at one time. Come on now. So the first order of business here to get you started on resolving conflict is for the two of you to sit down and pick a problem and try to address that one only. Which brings me to my second point. The two of you need to treat these conflict resolution moments as a business meeting. So that's point number 2. You're going to have a business meeting. You're going to treat one another the same way you would a coworker at work. You're going to then come up with one problem that the two of you agree is one of the top 3 problems. That's 3 things now, people. Pay attention. Just create a business meeting. The two of you are going to agree on a problem that lies in the top 3, and you're only going to work on that one problem for now. The other thing that gets in the way is the two of you will tend to want to try to resolve a problem when you're already mad. Dumb idea. That's point number 4. Only have this business meeting where you're addressing one problem that the two of you agreed is in the top 3 of all the problems. You're only going to discuss this when you're calm. Now we have 4 points now. Are you paying attention? The 5th point. We said we're going to conduct this like a business meeting. There's this thing called taking notes. You want to write this stuff down because you won't remember what you said next week. And somebody's going to say, no, I didn't say that, or no, we didn't agree to that, or when did we talk about that part? Write it down so that when one party says, no, I didn't say that, or we didn't talk about that, you go to the notes of the meeting, you look and you go, see, yeah, we did talk about that, we did say this, we said exactly this, and we wrote it down, and you agreed to such and such. Write it down. You need proof, you need accountability, you need something that will help you to remember what the hell you said. Now, I understand this isn't a problem-solving strategy in and of itself, but at least it begins the process. If you can't even begin the process, then you're getting nowhere fast. So let me recap. Pay attention. You're going to make a business meeting. You're going to take notes. The two of you are going to agree on what the main problem, or at least one of the top 3 main problems are. And you're only going to deal with that one. You know, the family is a business in a sense. You're, in many cases, if not most cases, you're raising children. You're trying to keep a household. You're paying bills. You're maintaining property and vehicles. It's a business in the fullest sense of the term, if you think about it. And so when you're trying to resolve marital issues, and the two of you are partners in this business, you have to treat it like a business. And people in the business meeting don't go into the meeting talking about how they feel about things. They don't go in expressing anger, resentment. They don't go in throwing blame. They try to be politically correct. They try to be open to compromise. They try not to offend anybody because they want their points to be well taken and they want their goals to be accepted. And so they present their case very tactfully, as should you. If you will do these things, I can promise you at least the two of you can get to the table and start discussing some things. So, quick message to all the autistic spouses out there who want to have a better relationship with their, in this case, neurotypical spouse. What do you have to do before you can have a better relationship with your neurotypical spouse? You have to reduce your anxiety, because your anxiety gets in the way on so many different levels. If you watched any of my other YouTube videos, anxiety is almost always at the core of your relationship difficulties with your NT wife in this example. So, you have to reduce your anxiety. What do you have to do before you can reduce your anxiety? You have to relax. What do you have to do before you can relax? You're going to have to slow down, cognitively and physically. You have to slow your mind down. You got to slow your body down. Literally slow it down. Well, what are you going to have to do before you can slow your mind down? You're going to have to focus on breathing several times a day. You're going to have to be a deliberate thinker. I'm just going to sit here for a while and focus on my breath. In breath, out breath. What do you got to do before you can slow your body down? You're going to have to move slowly. You're going to have to move slowly. Get up from your chair slowly. Sit down slowly. Walk slowly. Drive slowly. Talk more slowly. Pretend like you're a 95-year-old man or woman. Slow down, buddy. Slow it down. What's your rush to get to the finish line? Which is death. And if you have ASD level 1, you know your average lifespan is about 54. Don't race to the finish line. The more you slow down, the further the finish line is from your current location. The more you slow down, the further away the finish line. The more you physically slow down and slow your mind down through breath work, the more you relax. And the more you relax, the more you reduce your anxiety. And the more you reduce your anxiety, the more you're in a better position to have quality time, quality relationships. Reverse engineer this thing, okay?
So one of the things would be emotional self-awareness. Now, the NTs in here, when they are, I want to make up an example, when they are fearful of something, they have some anxiety about something, but they don't know what the source of the anxiety is. They go purely on the physical signals, get a lump in their throat, maybe they start to get sweaty, maybe they start to get the blood pressure comes up, in their visceral area, they start to have this yucky feeling in their stomach. And they can tell that even though they couldn't put their finger on what's raising their anxiety, their body is telling them that something is not right. The guy with ASD, oftentimes he won't know that he's escalating on the anxiety scale until after he's blown up. And then you'll go, oh, I guess I was anxious. I didn't catch that way back when I was building up. So when my body gives me physical signals that something is wrong, do I pay attention to it and sense what's going on? Do I ignore it? Or do I not even pick up on it at all? That's going to be emotional awareness. Another piece would be empathy. That's not a new word for you coming from me. So you could ask yourself, do I really listen to people when they talk about their issues, or do I just try to jump to a solution? Or as they're talking to me, am I really lost over here in my fantasy world thinking about something else because their topic is boring? Do people confide in me, or do they know that if they come to me, they're not going to get much in the way of consideration, that type of thing? Another component to emotional intelligence, we'll call it, would be impulse control. So a question you could ask yourself was, do I respond to people before they finish telling me something? Or am I quick to want to hurry up and get the conversation over with? Am I quick to want to interrupt the normal flow of give and take conversation and start talking about my special interests and so on? Another component to emotional intelligence would be interpersonal relationships. Do I enjoy socializing with people, or does it feel like work? Do I enjoy talking with my wife, or does talk feel like work? Do I enjoy having sex with my wife, or does sex feel like work? Perhaps the last component, not that there's just these, emotional intelligence, we could call it self-actualization. Am I doing the things in life that I'm really passionate about? Do I really enjoy interpersonal interactions at work, at home? Do I feel like I have a sense of purpose? So that would be another component to emotional intelligence. It's totally common for a child, this usually happens in childhood, where he is the opposite of a sociopath. He's an empath. And he learned at a very young age that it was too anxiety-provoking to feel others' pain. And he learned, and this probably all happened at an unconscious level, because he didn't know what he was doing, learned to shut his feelings off because it was too painful to feel other people's pain. And I refer to this as the paramedic effect. If you're a paramedic, you cannot be an empath because you're dealing with death, destruction, babies being mutilated in cars, stumbling on the scenes where there's mass murder and blood everywhere. The same thing happens with military individuals during time of war. You can't be an empath and be a good soldier. If you're concerned about hurting somebody in times of war, you're at a huge risk. You have to shut it off at the neck, your feelings. So it's not terribly uncommon for some of these guys on the autism spectrum who appear to lack empathy. It's not that they don't lack empathy, they don't display empathy, and at some level they've learned to shut their emotions off.
What I run into a lot, as in 100% of the time, in working with people on the autism spectrum, is that they have a tendency to think very poorly of themselves. And we will just call this stinking thinking. And as you have experienced, whether you realized it or not, the same old thinking will yield the same old results. So here are some common examples that people on the autism spectrum may face that lead to toxic, stinking thinking, followed by its replacement thought to help you shift your focus. Okay, number one, you're a failure, right? No, you're a person who sometimes fails, and that's okay, you'll try again. Number two, you're a product of your past. You can't change anything, right? Wrong. Things have happened in the past that influenced your behavior, but you can learn to modify how you think and react. People can and do change, even those on the autism spectrum. Number three, you make a ton of social mistakes and you don't deserve good things in life. Correct? Incorrect. What you did may have been awkward socially, but you can forgive yourself and try again. Next, it's easier to avoid this problem than to face it. No. In the long run, it's better to face this problem and accept your role in it. Then there can be a resolution and improved relationships. Next, things always go wrong for me, right? Wrong. You must accept that things will go wrong sometimes, and that's not a big problem in most cases. Next, this problem shouldn't have happened. I'm to blame or my spouse is to blame. Nope. You might very well be at fault sometimes. Your spouse is at fault sometimes, but neither you nor your spouse are to be blamed because we all make mistakes and we can improve based on the lesson learned. Next, to be worthy and have high self-esteem, you have to be competent and victorious in all respects. You can't expect to be perfect. It's okay to make mistakes and then learn from those mistakes. It's only a failure if you make a mistake but refuse to learn from it.
My recommendation would be to not apologize anymore because when you continue to say, I'm sorry you feel that way and this and that, if she's already rejected your apologies, I can promise you, your I'm sorries will just be insulting to her at this point. She will download that as more insincerity. Save yourself the breath. A better line might be, I understand that even though I didn't intend to hurt you, it hurt anyway, and what can I do to help? That's your line. Remove I'm sorry from your vocabulary. Here's the new line. I didn't intend to do that particular thing, but I understand it hurts you anyway. What can I do to help?
Shh. You want to know a secret to a happy marriage? Marry a woman that loves football every bit as much as you do. Yeah, that's my wife right there. Shh. Message to autistic husbands. What's the absolute number one thing you can help in your neurodiverse marriage with your neurotypical wife? Spend time with her. Just be with her. Not necessarily doing anything for her. Just be with her, be near her, be present, and not distracted. No cell phone, no computer, nothing. You're just going to be next to her, and she is your special interest for the moment. Quick message to a neurotypical wife married to an autistic spouse. You know what the absolute number one thing you can do to help your neurodiverse marriage is to catch your autistic spouse doing something right and point it out. Say, hey, I appreciate that you did that. You know what the number one dynamic I see play itself out in the neurodiverse marriage where one spouse is autistic and the other one is not? The neurotypical spouse always feels lonely. The autistic spouse always feels like a failure. So a lot of spouses on the autism spectrum have what I'm just going to call learned helplessness, and this phenomenon occurs when the autistic spouse comes to believe that he has little
or no control over the relationship difficulties, and that whatever he does to try to change a bad situation is futile. So as a result, this discouraged spouse will stay passive in the face of any unpleasant, harmful, or damaging state of affairs, even when he actually does have the ability to improve his circumstances. Now, learned helplessness can be thought of as believing you are incompetent, that you have no control over the outcome, that it doesn't matter what you say or do, since outcomes no longer depend on actions, and that your actions are pointless. So in order to qualify for this learned helplessness, the person on the spectrum really needs to have these three conditions in place. He has to become inappropriately passive, and this passivity has to follow exposure to numerous unresolved arguments with his spouse, and there is a change in the way this person thinks about his ability to control similar future marital conflict. The spouse on the spectrum with learned helplessness has certain rationalizations and self-talk that could go something like this. Adopting a passive stance provides me with a sense of control over my life circumstances. Beating my head against a brick wall wastes time and energy and is potentially harmful. Hope has its limits. Persistent attempts to control the uncontrollable are futile, and remaining passive allows me to conserve energy when the evidence tells me there is simply nothing else for me to do. So when a spouse on the spectrum feels like it doesn't matter what I say or do, it's never good enough, and my attempts to work on the relationship make the problems worse, this individual will tend to have an external locus of control. For example, he may say things to himself like, I have no control over what happens to me or what happens in this relationship. And he will tend to view unwanted outcomes as permanent. For example, because we couldn't resolve the most recent conflict, therefore we probably won't be able to resolve any conflicts. So we could say that this individual is easily discouraged and somewhat pessimistic, and so he will tend to highlight and emphasize risks. He will highlight problems, is likely to suffer anxiety and depression, is overly concerned with safety and currently does not feel safe in the relationship, is often very passive, which would take the form of shutdowns. He will tend to promote caution, critical thinking, skepticism, and defensive measures. He will recover slowly after an argument, if at all, and quite honestly, he simply feels defeated and stops trying. So this individual needs to realize that there is this other thing called an internal locus of control, which is I do have control over circumstances. I can't control everything, but I can control me. I can control my responses. I do have some ability and power in this relationship. And he also needs to understand that the vast majority of things are not permanent. Rather, they are temporary. So what I run into a lot is this situation where the man, in this case, we'll use the ASD man and the NT wife as the example, he is literally afraid of his NT wife at this point when the conflict has gone on for years unresolved. And this usually starts out by she, the NT wife, has not experienced the degree of emotional reciprocity that she wants and needs and desires. A lot of her expectations are not being met. This goes on for quite a few years. With good intention, she tries to reconcile differences, trying to make the relationship work, trying to fix some broken pieces, and her good faith effort usually downloads in his mind, the ASD man, as complaining, criticism, being parental, constantly correcting him. And so now he feels like he's on thin ice all the time, like he's in the doghouse much of the week. And I have heard so many self-reports from these men that they honestly are afraid to say much or do much because they just assume that they're going to get in trouble. And so they tend to basically go into shy mode. And this could look like he's spending less time with you. He doesn't really want to engage conversation with you. He may view you as his major source of anxiety. He tends to be preoccupied with other things. And that downloads in the NT wife's mind as he doesn't care about the relationship. I'm not important to him and so on. But in many cases, what's really going on, he is just trying to avoid drama and conflict and arguments. He doesn't feel like he can win. And at some level, he's given up hope because he's, in his mind anyway, he has tried numerous things, none of which seem to help anything. And these men will say this a lot. It doesn't matter what I say or do, it's never good enough. And they are literally afraid, and I'm not exaggerating, they are constantly overly concerned, for good reason in their mind, that it's better to say nothing at this point, because when I try to fix it, oftentimes it makes a bad problem worse. And they're basically in a form of flight.
And you may notice as an NT wife that sometimes he flips to the other side of that spectrum and goes into fight, which would be the meltdown, adult temper tantrum, and so on, and then flips back to the shutdown. So the moral to the story then is we need to come up with a communication strategy such that the NT wife can get her point across. In this case, the point being I need to get some of my needs met, without that downloading in his brain as I'm being attacked yet again. And so I really need to protect myself, and how I protect myself is to disconnect. So I have an exercise for both the NT spouse and the ASD spouse. And this assignment, and it would be good if you could journal or write a paragraph or two about this, would be to look at what's going on underneath the arguments. So we argue with one another because we are angry with what's going on. We feel that there's some unfairness, that some things are just not right. We want to fix it. And so we get angry. Both the NT and the ASD individual get angry. So that's what's underneath the argument is anger. But what's underneath the anger is fear. And that's what I would like for you to look at and journal. So the question then becomes, when you argue with your spouse, what is the fear that's motivating that argument? Is it fear of not getting your needs met? Fear of loss? Fear of being chastised, ridiculed, criticized, put down, disrespected, and so on? So we don't argue for no good reason. You spend a lot of time and energy arguing. In fact, if you've had a knockdown, drag-out argument that has lasted for an hour or more, you may have realized that you're exhausted, because it does burn up a lot of energy. And so if you could look at the fear that's motivating these arguments, that's motivating the anger, then the next step then would be, okay, what can I do to address the fear? Because my arguing isn't addressing my fear one bit. It's actually increasing my anger because we never get anything resolved, which in turn is increasing my fear, which means the next time we argue about the same damn thing, it's even going to be more intense than the previous time. So that's the assignment, guys and ladies. I want you to begin the process of debriefing or going back and investigating your arguments in retrospect after they have already happened. You wouldn't necessarily have to do this as a couple. It would be probably better to do it individually. And go back and replay that argument that happened earlier today or yesterday or last week, and do a little investigation. Examine, why was I so invested in defending myself or arguing or pouring out all of these angry words that I threw at the other person? What was the fear motivating that? So the next part of the assignment would be then, when you have your list of fears, go back and look at, what can I do to get these fears addressed? We'll use the example that may be consistent with what some NT wives experience. We'll go with the fear of not getting my emotional needs met. So the next time you would have the propensity to argue and fight and get angry, instead maybe you could actually have a conversation rather than an argument about how I can get my emotional needs met. So you'd want to brainstorm some ideas about that, and then you could present that in a calm manner to your spouse. Let's use an example for the man who has autism spectrum disorder, and maybe one of his fears is being criticized. So now you would need to brainstorm some ways that you could converse with your NT wife such that her words didn't download as criticism in your brain. So the hope then is that you could actually have a conversation rather than an argument, and give your NT wife some ideas on how she can express herself such that you don't view that as put downs, criticism, her being parental, exaggeratory, and so on. So this is not a magic bullet, but it's certainly the beginning of looking at the core issue, which is your fears. If you want more details on how to do this and go deeper into this exercise, then by all means, email me, and we can elaborate and broaden this exercise in a more thorough manner and do a deeper investigation into what's going on underneath the anger. Today I wanted to talk briefly about the strong points associated with people on the autism spectrum. Too often the microscope is focused on all that is wrong with people who have Asperger's or high-functioning autism. Yet these individuals actually have much more to contribute to families, friendships, and the workplace than the general population recognizes. It's quite true that there are hundreds of strengths associated with Asperger's and high-functioning autism, so any attempt at a list is going to stereotype these people, but here are 4 strengths that come to mind and that I witness most often. often. Number one, it's a cliche by now to say that some adults with Asperger's and high-functioning autism have higher than average intelligence, but that doesn't make it any less true. Some people on the spectrum are downright smarter than just about everyone else out there, and some are quite aware of it and aren't afraid of telling others about their level of expertise in a particular field or subject. The second one, many adults with Asperger's and high-functioning autism have a wonderful sense of humor that demonstrates a truly unique way of viewing the world. Whether it's the humor found in someone making the same mistake over and over, or the hilarity found in seemingly irrelevant details of social situations, neurotypicals can learn a lot about how to appreciate details in life that they never would have noticed without learning from their partner on the spectrum. The third one, another strength is the fact that people on the spectrum are going to tell the truth about something, whether you like it or not. Perhaps he has something figured out that you don't, and he isn't afraid to tell you. Perhaps the answer to a problem is obvious to him, and it's annoying how slow the neurotypicals are to figure it out, and he isn't going to hide that annoyance. Maybe it's a case of just being brutally honest with you when your haircut looks ridiculous, but the honesty that the individual on the spectrum possesses is refreshing in this pretend world of political correctness, contrived so-called reality television, and unrestrained commercialism that we all live with on a daily basis. It's really cool to have someone just tell it like it is every now and then. And the fourth and final one, many people with Asperger's and high-functioning autism have an absolutely uncanny ability to focus. Sometimes this manifests in inconvenient ways. For example, focusing only on the irrelevant details of a learning situation and therefore having difficulty with learning the bigger picture. But just as often, this manifests in ability to solve problems that would stump the neurotypical. For example, one employee with Asperger's syndrome helped engineer the dependent relations between hundreds of different components of a software system. The problem was that not only did it require a huge amount of focus, but a huge amount of focus over a long period of time, because every detail that was changed in the system caused hundreds of other small changes in the ways all the other components of the system depended on one another. This particular individual accomplished in a few days what the company expected to take several months. So without question, the high-functioning autistic brain operates differently. Most of these individuals are better at detecting changing sounds, detecting visual structures, and manipulating 3D shapes. Now, too often, employees don't realize what these individuals are capable of and assign them repetitive, almost menial tasks. But most are willing and capable of making sophisticated contributions to society if they have the right environment.
Hey guys, this is Mark, and I got a question from a man on the autism spectrum, and he says, I'm not sure if I feel love or not. I think I do, but I'm just not sure. Well, just know that for all of you guys out there with ASD, doesn't matter whether you have ASD or not, doesn't matter whether you're male or female, love is your natural state in the absence of fear. Love is your natural state in the absence of fear. Now, if you are in some form of fear, for example, toxic guilt, toxic shame, regrets about the past, worries about the future, feeling sorry for yourself, feeling vindictive, and so on, then love cannot coincide with those states of mind. So eliminate the fears as much as possible, and when you're in a non-fearful state, you are by default in your natural state of love. Hey, this is Mark Hutton. Would you like to schedule a one-on-one Zoom call? Okay, it's so simple. Just look under any of my videos in the description area. Click on this Calendar link. Now you see my calendar. Pick your month, your day, anytime that's available. Enter your name and email address. Then you'll get a follow-up email with the Zoom link on the day and time that you picked. And voila, we will talk.